Hey there, welcome to Blockhead, the Peanuts tribute podcast from a cartoonist's point of view. My name is Geoff Grogan, and I will be your host for the next few minutes to talk about Peanuts, Charles Schulz, and all things Charlie Brown, Linus, Lucy, and Snoopy too. So sit back and enjoy. Blockhead listeners, welcome to a new episode. Today we have part 2 of our discussion with Kevin Mutch, the cartoonist behind that fabulous new graphic novel, The Rough Pearl. Rough Pearl is available wherever good graphic novels are sold, at your independent bookstore, at Barnes & Noble, online at Amazon, obviously, and more importantly at Fantagraphics.com. So head on over there, check it out, pick up a couple of other things while you're at Fantagraphics. The website is really chock full of wonderful comics, and this isn't paid for, by the way. This is just me telling you. If you're not familiar with that website, check it out. There are lots of other independent publishers out there worth checking out too these days. Try to help them stay afloat if you've got the available funds. Get some of your comics directly from the publishers. It's certainly going to help them in these difficult economic times. And your local bookstore needs to help too, right? Like me, you're probably a big fan of bookstores, and these days everybody's having some difficulty staying in business. So let's do our part and read more books. And one of those great books these days is the graphic novel, The Rough Pearl, by Kevin, my good friend Kevin. And this was a great conversation. This is part 2 of a very long and wide-ranging discussion. Among the things that we talk about that I think was very interesting was this one subject that came up in the middle here that Kevin and I don't necessarily see eye to eye on. Although, in retrospect, there's probably lots of common ground, and that's the idea that heavy subjects, serious subjects, are best dealt with by a kind of realistic visualization. And that's an interesting point. And certainly there are all kinds of examples in the history of comics wherein serious subjects and in film and elsewhere are tackled by a relatively straightforward, realistic approach to visualization. And so I can see that point. But at the same time, I don't think it necessarily negates the idea that a cartoony, a Bigfoot cartoony style or whatnot, can't handle heavy-duty subject. And so I kind of fumbled it, though, in the interview because my mind wasn't working. I guess I hadn't had my Wheaties or something. My mind was not touching base with the great cartoonists who deal with heavy-duty subjects, who have a kind of cartoony approach to them. And I'm wondering if you're thinking of some examples right now. So give it some thought. Think it through. Can heavy-duty subjects, such as, in the case of Mouse, the Holocaust, be dealt with adequately by a cartoony, an exaggerated cartoony approach to the subject matter? Interesting idea. And of course it has an impact on we as cartoonists, how we approach our own work when we're dealing with heavy-duty subjects. So let's think about that. Discuss among yourselves, and we'll come back to that at the end of the show. Maybe I'll have thought of a few by then. I hope so. So let's get to the conversation. It's a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Kevin Mutch and myself in conversation. So we ought to talk a little bit about your process, because we talked about writing a lot.
Yeah.
And writing obviously is the backbone of every story, right? Every comic story. We talk about this when I
think about it as absolutely the priority.
Sure.
Is the storytelling. And I know you and I have discussed this extensively in the past, and I know we're on a very similar page about this. But I find that maybe up until to be honest, I haven't followed a lot of comics in the last 10 years or so, because I got just so busy doing them.
Right.
And
oh my gosh, yeah.
And being a parent and having a business and all of this, I feel like like maybe the pendulum is starting to swing back in the world of indie comics, back towards storytelling. I think of people like Noah Van Sciver. Is it Sciver? How do you pronounce his last name? Sciver?
Yeah.
Noah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I think of his books and some other things that I've seen, and even some people that have been doing this kind of like, what I would have always thought about as that kind of Fort Thunder, I've always referred to it as like kind of stoner art.
Yeah.
Some of them are writing now in a way that's a little more, about the story. Like I think of Michael DeForge, for example, as someone who writes, even though he's doing this type of cartooning that formally might fall into that, category that may be at its most popular extreme. You could talk about like Adventure Time or something like that on television. That sort of rubber hose animation derived, 60s influenced, Yellow Submarine influenced kind of art.
Right.
Which was for a long time, it was about the art, not the story.
Yeah. Oh, very much so.
And that became like kind of the prevalent, overwhelming stance that got taken. Certainly 10 years ago it was. In fact, I was just looking through a Best American Comics from 2013, and I got to the 50 or 60 pages of it that's just given over to one story after another like that, with the bright psychedelic color.
Oh, yeah.
What would happen if we took bright purple and put it next to lime green, man? Oh, it's vibing right out, man. And you're sitting there going, is there a story here? Or is it just a bunch of like, do I need to be high? I guess I do. And I'm hoping that pendulum has swung back. But to get back to your question, in my own case, I have always thought that the story should come first, even for this kind of auteur comics. You could talk about very powerful writing in comics at the level of more popular comics, like Alan Moore, and how, or Garth Ennis, and how people like that have really managed to create a kind of like a type of comics that's very writer driven. And
yes.
Watchmen is first and foremost about Alan Moore, and then people talk about I'm spacing on the guy's name. I love Dave Gibbons' work. I love his art. Yeah. But it's interesting that reversal kind of took place, because for so long it was the other way around. And it was certainly that way up until, and I think maybe in an ongoing way in indie comics, in art comics.
Oh, hell yeah. I made a couple of those.
Right? And I think for myself, I was just never as driven by the art, even though I have a background as a visual artist,
Right. You were a painter and still are in some ways,
still
right?
am, yeah. And so I have this whole background, I'm very sympathetic to the art. And as a kid, I, wanted to be a comic book artist, not a comic book writer. But I was also very interested in science fiction stories, and then I wound up doing art criticism. So I had these kind of twin tracks, And in coming back to comics and drawing them again, I found that even though I'm very interested in the story first, and secondly, I would say the graphic narrative aspect of telling the story in panels, the sort of structure or diagramming that people talk about sometimes about comics, I think of that as like sort of the second thing. And then the third thing would be the drawing. I actually could farm that out. But if I did, not that I would because I don't have the money, but if I ever could, I would, because it takes me 20-something hours to draw a page of comics and about an hour to write it.
Yeah.
I'd love to get more done. I'd love to farm out the drawing, but I wouldn't hand somebody a script. I would hand them a rough.
You'd be like Stan Lee.
Yeah, I mean, did Stanley draw like little, kind
I
of
don't think he did, but
doodles?
I think he you're right. He didn't do a rough. He just gave people like a line or two and said, "Go do this," and then when they brought it
Yeah,
back, he scripted it.
yeah. I would do it the way, a lot of people do what they call thumbnails. I
Yeah.
don't draw thumbnails because to me that's like too small. But I do them on a sheet of like, I was going to say typing paper, which betrays my age, but printer paper. I do them on a sheet of printer paper, 8.5 by 11, letter size.
But
And
oh, I'm sorry, Alan Moore does that, doesn't he?
does he? I don't know.
Yeah, I think he writes out very specific instructions for staging, and then he also does, at least I think he used to do little thumbnail drawings. Now you said you wouldn't
Yeah.
do thumbnails, you'd want to do something bigger, right? But keep
Yeah, I
going.
do. I call them roughs or layouts. Like I it's almost like a loose first draft if I was drawing in a cartoony style, because my native style is cartoony, very cartoony. Um, and I was very influenced by Funny Animal Comics and by Robert Crumb and Underground Comics, Gilbert Shelton. So I do draw in a very cartoony way. If somebody's like getting a book from me at a convention and I'm supposed to sign the thing and do a little drawing in it, I
Hmm.
do it super, even in in a book like The Rough Pearl, where it's like it looks kind of like realistic.
Yeah.
My but if I was doing a little drawing in the front, it would be a very cartoony drawing because that's how I draw.
Oh man, that's interesting.
So my layouts would be like that. It would be like a rough draft of if I was doing the thing in my cartoony style. So that gives me the panel layouts. It
Mhm.
allows me to think about timing. So it's all of these things that are not text based, script, that wouldn't be so much in the script. It's
Mhm.
about the point of view and the angle and how big is this panel? Is this panel wide or narrow? How many panels to a page? How do you break up the time and the space? You can do all of that in a cartoony way. So I do. And just a rough cartoon. And sometimes I've looked at them and been very tempted to just polish them up. And people say, I love your cartoony style.
Mhm.
But the problem I have is that I like gravitas. I like this idea, like, a book like Berlin by
Yeah, I
Jason Lee.
love that book. Oh my gosh. Those
Deadpan drawing, deadpan realistic drawing.
Yeah,
I love that.
I do too. Those I haven't gotten the third volume yet, but the first two just blew me away. Berlin is, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, Jason Lutz, Berlin. I can't recommend it enough. Fabulous book. But go on. Yeah.
And the thing is, he's writing about something heavy.
Yeah.
He's writing about coming up to the Second World War. Fantastically interesting story about the rise of fascism and the struggle against it by communists and leftist Germans, not a widely recognized or understood story. I love the fact that he chose to do it in this kind of like uninflected or not particularly heavily inflected drawing style. And I think that there's not enough of that in comics. I think that there's a lot of comics where people are like, drawing in this cartoony way, and I sympathize. I do that myself. But I think that it comes at the expense of the possibility of getting heavy.
See, yeah, I can see what you're saying. I don't think they're mutually exclusive though. And I think, well, when we talk about cartoony and you talk about getting heavy, I mean, the first person who comes to mind is Art Spiegelman, and Mouse, and certainly that's cartoony and heavy. So, I mean, I see what you're saying about that, but I think
I think Mouse would have been a much better work if it hadn't been cartoony.
Okay.
I think, for one thing, I think it would have evolved. It would have avoided all of the political problems. Remember what Harvey Pekar said about Mouse?
I don't remember what he said. No. What did he say?
Harvey Pekar was very critical of Mouse and said that he found it very problematic that all of the different ethnicities in the story were assigned these animals to be.
Yeah.
The Poles, I think, was it the pigs? Poles were pigs?
I think so, yeah.
The Jews were mice, the Germans were cats, the Americans were dogs. And he said, the problem that he had with it, I'm paraphrasing, and I read this many years ago, but as I recall, his problem was that it set up this essentialism that was like almost racist. Where it was like, it wasn't happening because, and he also had a problem with depicting the Jews as vermin. It's mice.
Yeah, it was mice, sure.
He was like, that's kind of like going against the message, which I thought was like kind of a good point and perhaps not discussed enough. And then the Germans are, cats, right? It's like, well, they can't help it. It's in their nature, which is, I think it goes against the message of the story. And interestingly, Mouse started off as a shorter piece,
right,
that he did for an underground comic. I forgot what. I think it was something Kitchen Sink published. I forget. It's been a long time. But he did it as obviously coming from this perspective of like putting it in the context of a funny animal animated comic like the Fleischers would have done, or Fleischer Brothers, exactly, something like that from the 30s. It was in a more of a 1930s, again, what they call rubber hose animation style with the the loose bendy limbs. And when you read that first early draft and you see it in that context, there's a kind of like ironic intention that's very edgy and very clear that I think disappears from the final version of Mouse, which has this kind of like, I would almost call it like a kind of, and I'm spacing on the word here. What do they call you when you're a journeyman? It's like a journeyman's drawing where he's actually trying to make it a little less inflected. And so that the style drops back a little bit. And I remember, I forget who it was. Maybe it was you. somebody talking to me about his drawing style and how it was like, it was trying to hang back.
Yeah.
Be a little gray because the story was heavy. And this gets back to, the point that we were discussing earlier. I think that it would have been a stronger work if he had left the funny animal stuff out of it.
Well, you may have, that's a point I have to think about. I mean, I think the work stands as still pretty darn powerful piece of work, but yeah, there is a caveat and people do return to it, and upon reflection, I mean, I think you make some good points. So it's something to think about. But I still think I wouldn't really dismiss or be too dismissive of the cartoony approach in terms of seriousness. It does belie seriousness and heaviness, if you will, but I think we can still attack some pretty heavy duty material utilizing a fairly cartoony style or Bigfoot style. And I
mean, listen, Karl Barks is my more. If you said name one figure, one person, for me it's Karl Barks. Before Jack Kirby, before Mobius or any of these other people that are kind of heroes to me, Karl Barks, funny animal guy.
Funny animal guy.
And there was a little bit of heaviness that he got into, but obviously he's not the person to point to in terms of somebody pulling that off more successfully. Do you have an example? I don't know if I have one off the top of my head. I don't disagree with your point. I'm just trying to think of a good example.
Oh, of comics that, off the top of my head, I'm blanking out too. I mean,
somebody that's heavy but cartoony. Well, I mean, even like Pete Bagg with
Peter Bagg. Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Hate, right?
With Hate.
Yeah.
Very cartoony.
Yeah.
And gets heavy. You know. There's
Well,
some really. I mean, when they kill that one guy, or the one guy shoots himself, and then they have to contend with his corpse for years.
Yeah. Well,
It's very
there's a
heavy.
lot of different, I mean, ways of defining heaviness too, I mean,
Yeah.
um, it depends on what we're talking about. And so when I think about like something like, well, it's a show called Blockhead, right? So I think about Peanuts, and Peanuts is often sort of,
There you go. There's a good example.
yeah,
Peanuts.
and
Exactly.
it deals with psychology and the soul really,
Yeah.
and a lot of, and Schultz is over the course of 50 years pretty heavy in regard to
Yeah.
disappointment and
Yeah.
perseverance and all of those kinds of things that it deals with on a day-to-day basis. I think he
Yeah.
deals with that stuff pretty deeply.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, in a medium that does that, more often than not, does everything it can to subvert that quality.
Yeah.
Uh, he found a way to do it. So, yeah,
Yeah.
so there's
Well,
possibility.
let me try and finesse my thought about that then
Okay.
this way. I think that in general, I think that it's unfortunate that comics are called comics. It's as though all movies were referred to as comedies. You know,
Yeah.
did you see
Yeah.
the latest Meryl Streep comedy? Oh, that sounds funny. No, no, it's very heavy. You know?
I know. Yeah.
So I think that's a problem for comics because it's like, to this day, everyone's like trying to say, listen, these things can be serious. And I find that there's really, I think of comics as like the greatest medium to work in at the moment, even
Sure.
though I was just at some talk with here in Hamilton, actually, with Chester Brown.
Hmm.
And again, I had this nouns issue where I can't remember anyone's name or famous Canadian just put out famous Canadian cartoonist
Seth.
Seth. Thank you. So
Okay.
Seth and Chester Brown are giving this talk, and here in Hamilton, and
Oh, I've tried to
they,
get Seth on the show, but unsuccessfully so far.
yeah. So
But
they were
go.
talking about, and Seth in particular was talking about comics as like, in his view, a kind of medium in decline, which is, I think, arguably a fair point. Uh, Certainly in terms of its in original form, having any kind of widespread popularity the way it did at 40, 50 years ago. And you could argue, well, of course, it's like having a tremendous influence on popular culture, and not just through the superhero movies.
Right.
We sit around and we're watching the End of the Fucking World and the other one that they just did from Forsman. And I'm saying, you guys realize this is coming out of indie comics,
Yeah.
To my family, this is a Fantagraphics book, actually. So there's that argument. Okay, well, it's not a dying medium; it's having this influence, and I sympathize with that. But I'm actually, the thing that I think, contra to Seth's point about it as now starting to academicize and be taught in universities, and that's how you can tell it's on its way out. I'm not unsympathetic to that point. I just think in the case of comics, that, and let's say graphic narrative, because I don't even like the word comics.
Yeah.
Let's say comics, so I don't sound pretentious. In the case of comics / graphic narrative, I think that what it has going for it, that even though we point to film and TV and say this is popular culture, there's a problem or a crisis with that, which is the expense of it. I mean, this is why serious film disappeared from cinema, and now we all understand that movie theaters, to the extent that they were still a going concern, and maybe they won't be now because of the pandemic, but the understanding that you had to have a tentpole superhero type or Harry Potter type fantasy type story, a big special effects story, to even make that an economically viable prospect to make a big movie. And so serious film stopped being possible and got driven into television now. And arguably that's a good thing. And arguably, we're in the golden age of peak TV. I tend to agree with that, actually.
Yeah. So do I. Yeah.
There's this ongoing crisis of like the cost of production and the fragmentation of the market.
Yeah.
where you get smaller and smaller audiences. And after you're down below 1 million, when you're below like what HBO can pull in, then it starts to be like, how do you fund it? And I don't know if technological advances make that more possible in the future more cheaply, because certainly shooting digitally is cheaper, but you still have to pay for actors and sets and all of this. And at a certain point, as the audience fragments, as all of these outlets and streaming platforms arrive, you start thinking, does the business model break down? And I'll tell you what, I did not have to worry about that. In the 7 years I sat there doing the Rough Pearl, I did not have to worry about that. My time is my own, to the extent that I have a little spare time. If it's a couple hours a day, I can do the thing. And the cost for me to make that book was maybe $5 for a bunch of typing paper, I'll say it. Typing paper.
Well, I mean, that's the beauty of creation. That's the beauty of making comics. I mean, one of the things that struck me way back in the 90s when I started getting into independent comics and doing my own stuff was, look, I could just do this. And this was always the case too. Why I started painting. I had been a film student studying animation back in the late 70s, and then I was out.
And now you're doing animation again.
I'm doing animation again. I know.
It looks great.
Oh, thank you.
It looks completely professional.
Well, thank you. I am working my tail off to get better at it, and I'm working on 2 films. But that's a side point anyway. But the thing is, here's the thing. It goes right into what you're saying. I can do it in my living room with my laptop or my iPad on my lap. I'm just working away. I was working away this morning on an animated sequence, before we talked, and you couldn't do that 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Now you can. And so the technology, and even if you're not working with the technology, if you just have paper and pencil, you can make comics, you can make animation, you can make this stuff on your own. There are ways to get that stuff out there. You can make a movie, you can put it up on YouTube. You may not get 1 million people, but you've got your stuff, you've got your voice out there. Your voice is out there, and somebody's going to trip on it and find it, and it's going to relate to somebody else. I think there's something, okay, I don't know about this idea that comics are, the business model may be, in decline, and it'll have to find a new way of, I mean, one of the things I noticed, my mind is jumping all over the place now. One of the things I thought about way back in the 70s was when I was reading a lot of different literature. And one of the things I noticed was all these writers were university professors, all of them. Mm-hmm. And I began to think to myself, patronage exists in the university. It seems like, in order to get something done, you've got to have some support system. And in order to find a support system, it looks like all these writers are all coming from English departments. And I thought, wow, and the same thing is true of painting, right? The patronage system.
Yeah, and it corresponds with to go back to Seth's point, it really does correspond to the death of the medium.
The death of the medium, or the death of the business model?
Well, the death of, let's say the moribundity of the work.
It could, yeah. I mean, it's certainly
like a lot of like academic, writing. Like, I just hate a creative writing department writing. You know what I mean? Like
that fits within the mold. Yeah, sure. You know. The Maverick stuff, but you can still find, like, I mean, Kurt Vonnegut was teaching in a writing program, and I love Vonnegut, and John Irving. Those are some of the people I was reading about.
Yeah.
And
Vonnegut came up like he was selling stories,
Yeah.
Like he was he came up like making a living as a writer, fairly disreputable corner of publishing.
Yeah.
But wound up teaching.
Yeah.
I'm not totally unsympathetic to the Academy. In fact, I was teaching at McMaster University here this term, and was really crushed when the pandemic hit, because I was having a riot teaching painting.
Oh, great!
But I'm very conscious of the fact that those sources of support, those types of patronage, really limit the art. They really make it, in visual art in Canada, so much of the funding for artists is government grants.
Yeah.
And the work reflects the patron.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I mean, you can see that, sure. It's not always true, not 100% true, but I think you've got a point. I mean,
you
there's
get this really academic, boring, politically correct work in Canadian art, and American art is arguably in a better position because there's a commercial gallery system in existence that does support it. But it's also like obvious that, that work is being produced for a whole other series of very problematic economic reasons for, the richest people in the world.
Yeah.
Which is a different discussion. And I think it doesn't have a very good effect on that work either.
Yeah, one of the things I've always loved about comics is exactly, I mean, is that it's not for those people,
Exactly.
It's being produced for I don't know, anybody, but it's not being
it's
produced
DIY. It's DIY. Anyone can sit down and make one. Anyone can get them out. You put them on the internet if you want.
Yeah.
You put out a zine, and it's more punk rock than a punk rock record.
Well,
because a punk rock record was more expensive to produce.
Yeah, you need studio time, or well, now you just need the equipment. But I mean, there's a vitality, and that was what got me into comics in the 90s again. The same kind of thing that happened to you, but for me, it happened in a comic shop, and I was in Jim Henley's, near the Empire State Building, and it was just after I finished grad school, and I was like, well, what am I going to do? I mean, what happens next? And I was in this comic shop, and I was like, well, actually, before that, my wife had turned me on to a bunch of comics that she picked up at a street fair, and they were like, a quarter each or something. And she bought a bunch of them. And I was just like tripping on the vitality and all this independent stuff, I mean, it's just incredible. And when I was in Jim Henley's following that, I looked at this, rack of books, none of which were superhero, all of which seemed to come out of left field, and from disparate points of view. And I was like, this is like the greatest little art gallery in the frickin' world. There's just so much great stuff here. And it's coming from who knows where. I just thought it was the most exciting thing because it tied into what was always exciting for me about comics, which was that it was really, there was a kind of democratization about it, even though it was by people who were, within the economic sphere that I could understand, for people in that same economic sphere, 12 cents, 15 cents for a comic book. I could afford it. I can't afford DC and Marvel comics today. It's too expensive, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I forget who I was just listening to, some other cartoonist getting interviewed, and he was saying the same thing, that it's like, comics ought to be $1 or $1.50.
Yeah.
And I agree. I mean, how do you expect to forget the good, high quality paper and forget the,
I like
all this jazz.
Yeah. I mean, I love the collected books. We were just talking about Fantagraphics in your book. It's a beautiful piece of art. And it glows in the dark, by the way, people. So
yes, it does.
Check that out. But, that was one of the things, I love all the collected stuff. I love all the archival stuff. I love all of it. I have a great, wonderful, big library of books. But at the same time, when it came to comic books, the floppies, man, 25 cents, I could buy 4 of them, and on newsprint, and they were as good as anything, sometimes even better. And I loved them for that, I loved them.
I could do that every week. I'd cut the grass or whatever, and then I could buy a bunch of comics.
Yep.
And my son loves to go and buy comics, but they're $5.
Yeah.
He'll get 1 or 2.
Yeah. And you can't do it on and I haven't been able to buy comics on a regular basis since I've been an adult. Hey listeners, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I hope you're enjoying today's interview. If you are and you want to show support, head on over to my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Geoff Grogan. At Patreon, you can contribute as little as $1 on a regular basis to ensure the longevity of this podcast. Your support will help keep it not only commercial free, but free to the listening public. And in exchange, you'll get some pretty neat stuff. There are at least 3 different tiers. Each level offers its own distinct rewards. So check it out today at patreon.com/Geoff Grogan, GeoffGrogan. Any amount is welcome, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and that's patreon.com/Geoff Grogan. Because they're just too expensive, and that is a problem. I think there's a lot of problems with the economic model. I think there's a lot of problems with the corporate model, although in some sense that those, like you were talking about, big blockbuster movies keep the business afloat, make possible some of this other stuff. But then again, to the point at which now, as you were also pointing out, intimate movies, personal movies aren't in the theater anymore. They're on the television and or on the computer screen. And there's good things and bad things about that. I mean, there is nothing quite like seeing a movie in a big movie theater. And
living in New York really soured me on that. Because everyone talks.
I know.
You always feel like you're on the verge of getting into a fight.
Yeah, I know, right? I know. It's not, yeah.
Remember when I went to see, what was the Johnny Depp version of Hunter S. Thompson's?
Fear and Loathing?
Yeah, I went to see Fear and Loathing when that came out, whenever that was, the 90s. But I was in Manhattan, right? Mm-hmm. And some stoned guy was right in front of me, throwing popcorn and making a big... And I almost came to blows with the guy. I grabbed him by the arm and told him to fucking knock it off. It was that, that type of thing would happen to you. And now I sit here, with my family on the couch, and we watch these peak TV, serious and amazing shows that we just love. And it's somebody needs to go get a drink of water, and we pause it, and I love it. I wouldn't go back. I wish I had a bigger TV though.
Well, yeah, it's crazy. We watch everything. We got a little TV. It's a little, maybe 24 inches across. But most of the time when we go to bed at night and watch something, we're watching it on an old laptop, and it's 17 inches. That's the size of the screen, and that's it, man. It's terrible.
Although, if that's close enough to your face, it's like being in a giant movie theater with a giant screen, 30 rows ahead of you.
Yeah, and stories are great. It's just incredible stuff, and so a lot of that intimate stuff, personal filmmaking is finding its way there. I don't know, I think I don't know that we're going to live long enough to see the next paradigm shift, but comics will find. I don't think comics as a form is dying. I have to take issue with that. I think comics as a form is vital and will continue to be vital. And your book is just an example of that. And work continues to be produced that is still very powerful and very strong, and some of it is very funny, and some of it is throwaway, and I think it'll just continue to be as vital as anything. The economics of it, I don't know. That's not my thing, and I'm not. If I had an economic brain in my head, I'd hire some cartoonists.
Well, look, I mean, in my case, okay, so I did this book. I didn't need an advance.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The book was done.
Yeah, you were doing it on your own anyway.
Yeah, and it was even being seen to some extent because I was just posting it on the web. So nothing stopped me. It was finished, and now I'm happy to say, well, it got published, and it's getting looked at a little more than it would have otherwise have been, probably a lot more. But the point is, nothing stopped me, and that means it's a living form.
Yep.
For anyone else in that same position, and there are hundreds of thousands of people in that position. So that's the good news. Yeah. I remember 10 years ago, of course, you and I used to do a blog together called Next Issue.
Yeah, we did that for a little while.
And we would talk about some of these thoughts about the form of comics and ideas around comics, the history of things, and one thing that we were interested in at that time was the advent of tablets.
Yes.
And turned out to be iPads and then things of that nature, but they weren't quite out then. And
Right.
we were thinking like, will this have a really revolutionary impact on comics?
Oh, yeah.
Because does it make it cheaper and and on and on. And now in perspective, looking back on that historically, from today, I would say that the interesting thing that's happened with comics was that it kind of, I mean, first of all, they with Comixology, they really got together and said, we got to stop this or we won't have a print market. They kind of, I think I think there was a certain amount of, like, I don't want to say collusion, but there was certainly a certain amount of thought that went into the price point, and the price point that came out was high. So the price point for my book, The Rough Pearl, on Comixology is $14.99.
Yeah.
And the book is, which had to be printed and shipped and all of this, is $22 or something.
$22.99. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're not, I would have thought that you would have it up on Comixology for $2.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that has stopped it to some extent from spreading the way it might have into that medium or into that digital medium.
Yeah.
But I also think there was another factor that we didn't foresee at that time that's turned out to be important, which is the trophy quality of the book.
Yeah.
Of having it on your shelf. And it's not just comics, obviously. And it's certainly other types of book. And beyond that, it's even things like music, where, I do a lot of work in the music business for a living. And a lot of what I work on is, okay, we're putting this out on LP, on vinyl.
Yeah.
So that's a growing part of the market because young people really like the idea of having this tangible trophy object that, with nice production values.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I didn't see that coming.
No, nor did I. And I think that one of the things that's interesting about the experience we're all going through right now with COVID, as a teacher, we've heard so much from our students about how they miss being on campus or they miss the interaction with their peers, the tangibility of life in general is something that is absent, now in this new environment that we're dealing with. And while I've enjoyed teaching online, it's been a lot of work, but I've enjoyed aspects of it. For me, it's been great because I'm not commuting anymore. But my students, some of my students, not so much in my case, but in the case of other things, they find that those tangible elements of life are missing and are very important. And it's interesting because these guys are millennials, right? And they're supposed to be the digital generation, and that stuff's not supposed to matter as much to them. But it's clear that at least in this experience, it's reinforced the necessity of touch, as it were. And
and a kind of authenticity.
Yeah.
That all of that mediated living and social media, all of that digital stuff, it's wonderful. I mean, I love it, and I often think of something that I heard one time where somebody said, what this stuff is really doing is it's kind of re-enchanting the world, because all the magic got drained out of the world by like sort of the late 19th century by science,
Yeah.
And this is kind of re-enchanting the world. And I kind of agree with that. Like, I think there's this wonderful magic, but I also agree that there's this kind of like plastic, quality to it where it's only so rich, and then it just feels like phone sex or something,
Yeah.
And I understand that young people in particular have this kind of like sense of inauthenticity, and I'm very sympathetic to that because where I grew up in Canada, there's always been this sense of inauthenticity because you're flooded with American pop culture, American media. You watch a lot of American TV and movies and read a lot of American books and comics, obviously. And you feel like, well, where we are is like America, but not real. It's not real America.
Yeah.
And there's nothing there. I think it's arguably probably not quite as bad now as it was 40 years ago, because the cultures have diverged a little more and things evolved. But at that time, there was this widespread sense of like you couldn't be for real, in particular as an artist, unless you made it in the States.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
And so there was this feeling of inauthenticity, as though you were living in, Plato's cave, looking at the shadows on the wall.
Yeah.
But real reality was the States. That was not something that I, overtly thought about when I moved there. But in retrospect, boy, that feeling of like landing in New York, thinking I'm really, in the real world now.
Much as New York is, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm very sympathetic with the sense of like, where's authenticity? And the ironic thing for me was that towards the end, the last 10 or 15 years in the New York area, you just felt it all draining out of it. You felt all the life going, all the independent. I got there just in time to watch all the little used bookstores close, and all the diners were closing, and everything that had been there that had character was being replaced with like chain drugstores.
Sure, yeah.
And
I know.
Banks,
And that's when yeah, go ahead. No, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, moving to Hamilton. Hamilton is a real place. It has a real psychogeography, It's like it has grime and grit and history, and there's a spatial quality to life here where there's a geography to the place. There's a giant cliff. It's kind of like, if you know the relationship between Hoboken and then the towns on the cliff above it on the Palisade. It's a bit like that, but unlike Ontario, there's like a cliff, and then there's the old town at the bottom. And so everywhere you go, you're reminded that this is for real.
Yeah.
In New York, everywhere you go, you're reminded that this used to be for real.
In Manhattan, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, and in a lot of Brooklyn.
Yeah. In some parts of Brooklyn, yeah.
The Bronx is still for real.
Well, and there are a lot. And speaking as a former Brooklynite, there's a lot of places in Brooklyn that are for real too. But
it's
yeah,
being pushed out. It's like it's
Well, gentrification does that, but
yeah.
I think when we're talking about this, we're talking about the impact of the mega corporation in a way, and the late stage capitalism and all of that, right? And its impact on a culture. And what we're saying in a way is that, as this economic engine grinds on, it grinds up the spirit of life in a way.
Yeah.
And we all feel somewhat as though our souls are being robbed, or stolen.
Yeah. And to bring it back to comics, that's the thing that the printed book, this is what we missed 10 years ago in thinking about like, well, of course it'll go digital. Everything's going to go digital. That's great. And then there's been this kind of resistance to it. And I think it's coming from that exact place, that sense of like, I want the authentic experience of this object in my hands. Yeah. And 10 years ago, I would have been a little dismissive of that. Yeah. I would have been, oh, well, that's very precious of you. But, we're not all rich.
Yeah, well, that's the reality. I talk to a lot of newspaper comics, cartoonists, newspaper cartoonists on this show. And we all talk about the death of the newspaper.
You talked to Lynn Johnston, right?
Yes, absolutely.
She's from Manitoba, where I'm from.
Yeah, and she's out towards Vancouver now. I believe that was where it was. And she's great. I mean, she was fantastic, and what a wonderful person. But anyway, and a great story and great comics, that she's produced over the years. But, a lot of the discussion always revolves around what's happening with the newspapers. And I think the newspapers, in large part, are signing their own death warrant. But listen, there is something distinct about a newspaper comics page and that experience. And I'm not speaking from a nostalgic point of view, although probably informed by it some way. But the experience of reading comics on Instagram, the comic strips that I read on Instagram, is not the same thing. It's not the same vibe. It's not, and there is an authenticity that you're talking about to holding that newsprint in, and that's why we did Pood, man. The newspaper, there was a reason for that. It had a certain kind of newsprint, has a certain kind of quality and a certain reality and a certain.
You need to send a copy of Pood #4 to Karen Green at Columbia.
She doesn't have one?
She doesn't have one. Did you see that little thing she was doing about Pood?
I just saw one Facebook post, man. I didn't see.
Well, that was that's what I'm referring to. But it went on because other people were talking about it. Pood, for the listeners, is something Geoff and I published years ago together.
Yeah.
And it was an anthology broadsheet newsprint.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yep. 17 by 24, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. But anyway, Karen Green was talking about how she had all three of them. And I showed her #4. And she was like, oh, I don't have that. So she's a real completist, because she completes these. She has this collection of comics for Columbia.
Oh,
so if you have one, and you sent it to her at Columbia, she'd be thrilled.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, okay. Just she's a librarian there at Columbia, or in charge of. I can't remember.
Yeah, exactly. She's a librarian. And she was a medievalist, but then she wound up in charge of the comics collection.
Well, I will. I'll look up the mailing address and I will send her a copy. Sure.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail your point.
Oh no, but anyway, there's something to be said for that experience, and I don't know what replaces that experience. I don't know if anything can replace it, but seeking something with similar kinds of qualities, that as we've been talking about, the tangibility, the object quality of your book. It's not the same, holding that book in your hand is a very different thing. And it's hard for me, again, there's this whole life experience of reading books and holding on to books and paperbacks, reading, those, what is the guy?
Robert E. Howard.
Robert E. Howard. Yeah. Okay. Robert E. Howard books, and having those paperbacks in hand or whatever. It's a whole different kind of mentality.
Do you know what I did in the last decade?
No.
I went on eBay and reconstituted my childhood science fiction paperback collection.
Really? Oh
yeah.
How many books?
600.
Holy moly. 600 books.
And eBay lets you track down the exact same edition. The exact same, because for me, a lot of it was about I want that same paperback cover.
That same cover. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's great.
For the Edgar Rice Burroughs, obviously it's like the Frank Frazetta covers and the Roy Frankel covers from the Ace editions, right?
Yeah.
From the 60s.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. But, that's a wonder of eBay. But I actually, strangely enough, precipitating this podcast, I was seeking out Fawcett paperbacks of old Peanuts collections that I used to have as a kid. And a couple of Dennis the Menace things that I picked up, there's a joy to those things. And I love the paperback quality and I love the cheapness of them, but there's something about them that is irreplaceable. And the same thing, paperbacks were cool, because they were cheap too. And you get this great cover, and sometimes a pretty cool story.
I could, as a kid, I could afford to go to the local used bookstore.
Yeah.
And they were a quarter, a dime for these used science fiction books. They're all this was in the 70s and they were from the 60s. I would walk out of there with a little paper bag with a huge stack of those things.
Yep. Oh, me too. I loved used bookstores. Still do.
Yeah.
But Oh man, you could get some great stuff, and some great, absolutely great science fiction, great adventure stories, stuff that you wouldn't find in the drugstore, but still.
Yeah. So
Oh
it's
man.
funny because then there's this transition, that takes place between the kind of like fetishism of the book as you're reading it, that kind of like the feel of the paper.
Yeah.
My book is heavier than I expected. So for me, it's like the heft and the texture of the cover is not what I expected, and I like it,
Yeah.
So I'm very physically attached to it. But that transitions away once you've finished reading it into this trophiness where it goes on the shelf, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then you start talking about like I just heard somebody say the other day, you don't really own a book unless you've read the book.
Yeah.
So this idea of like the book on the shelf isn't just an old friend in the sense that, I read that book. It's proof.
Mm-hmm. Of an experience.
Yeah.
And that proof of your experience is there for you to revisit when you need to or when you wish to. And
even at a glance, even just the spine, it's still there. It's very reassuring.
Yeah. Oh man, I wouldn't trade. And absolutely. And you're right. It is a record and an embodiment of that experience.
Yeah.
Like smell or music will bring you back to another experience that, the first time you heard a song or you encounter a smell, it brings you back in time. It brings you back to that experience, but it's renewed when you open the cover and you start to flip it again.
And then you start thinking about like, what is the difference between the type of work that suits that whole idea of the kind of trophy or fetish object? What type of work suits that and what type of work doesn't? And that, I think, is where you start getting into the meat and potatoes of what's happened with digital media. Because some things are more ephemeral than that. And those are the things that I think really did wind up translating into tablets or other screens. And
like memes.
But not a lot of comics. I think to the extent that it's happened in comics, where it has worked, has been superhero comics, which were already coming at you in these kinds of installments. And I think a lot of people today, I'm not going to say kids because I don't know how many kids even read superhero comics, but younger people than us, people in, let's say, young men in their 20s and 30s, reading these superhero comics that come out in installments. I think for some of them, Comixology and things like that, where you buy it digitally and you look at it on a tablet, I think for some of them that does the trick. And I think some of them fetishize them and put them in long boxes and so forth.
Yeah.
I think very few people are consuming the more sort of serious indie graphic novels as ephemera. I think a lot of them are like, I have this object, I will not put it on my shelf, I have a collection of these. And it's more that way for them.
Well,
so things like newspapers, those translated perfectly into iPads, into
New York Times. Okay. So, but I'm thinking too, what you're just saying, as it's interesting, as this phenomenon, this application of comics, this bifurcation of comics into digital media and physical, and you talk about how the superheroes are translating. When I think about independent comics, alternative comics, personal comics, I think about your book. I think about Seth's last book, Clyde Fans, and the slipcase it came in, or I think about Chris Ware and Building Stories, right? That the packaging becomes part of the story now. Particularly with Chris Ware. The idea of it as an object becomes also part and parcel of the conception of the piece. So as in some sense, it's another manifestation of this kind of phenomenon that you're talking about.
Or the last Kramer's ergot that Alan Buenaventura did, the $125 one. That was that big thing.
I stopped looking at those. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I did too.
yeah. I mean, like you
Although
said,
Fantagraphics is doing them again. I
yeah.
have to pick one up and look at it.
What is their? They have what's it called now or something? I can't remember.
No, they're doing, well, they are doing now, but they're also doing Kramer's Ergot again.
Oh, okay.
They
Well,
took it I guess Sammy Harkin is still the editor.
it's like you said, this is the thing about my older age, and I don't know, and you said it too, is I'm so busy making stuff that I have very little time to read the stuff that I've bought that I want to read. You know what I mean? It's like the time has become, I don't know, I work all the time. That's one of the things the iPad has made possible. It's just like not constant 24/7 work. And I love it, but I can't stop, and put the
and also, I mean, you get to a point in life where you're very conscious of like, how much time do I have left to make work?
Yeah.
At my, at the peak of my cognition, let's say.
Yeah.
As we sit here struggling for nouns, right?
Yeah, I know, right? It's cool. No, that's exactly the case. I spend a lot of time, I should spend less time thinking that and more time working. But it's true, yeah. Christ, how much time do I have left, before the clock winds down? I got to get this done. And you realize that, you have to spend your time on things that really matter. And this has been one of them, this talk today. This is great. I mean, we haven't had a chance to connect like this in years, right? I think it's been years. I think last time I saw you was at a Brooklyn show. I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe.
I bet it was, yeah.
Yeah, it was at least that long. So anyway, Kevin, thanks for being on the show. It's been fantastic. Wow, we have covered a wide range of topics.
Yeah, you're going to need to cut this down, eh?
Well, split it up into 2 episodes probably is what I'll do. Because that's, I'm actually just going through another show right now, and I'm debating, should I keep it all, because it's about 2 hours, 2 hours is about the max that I do for a show. And I'm wondering, should I split it into 2 or just do the whole thing in one shot? And because the second parts of these things always tend to get a little less, in terms of downloads. But I think 2 hours is a long time for people to listen. So I don't know. Sometimes splitting it up makes a lot of sense. So this might be a 2-parter. We shall see. Probably will be. I tend to not cut very much out of the talk because I think the talk is kind of interesting, wherever it goes. And this one's gone some interesting places. I think people will appreciate it. But the most important thing to talk about is the Rough Pearl, and that book will, when the stores open up, and you can get out to the stores, you got to go pick it up because it's a terrific book. It is a really interesting, fun. It's funny in a kind of dark way, and it is also very insightful and revealing, I think. So, and it's also one thing to be said about it, as I think, sometimes bleak as it might seem in certain portions of the book, it's also very hopeful, I think. So I hope people will pick it up and look for it and order it. If you don't get to a bookstore, order it from Amazon or Fantagraphics, and because it's there. So, yeah.
Beautifully
Kevin,
said.
Well, yeah, I think it's important to support our independent comics artists, and I think this is an important book, and it's gotten some great reviews. And if you're curious and wondering about whether to spend your money, you can read the reviews because they're all really great. And
Knock on wood.
Yeah, Publishers Weekly did a nice one.
Yeah.
The Beat did an interesting one. So, and there are a bunch of others out there. It's a great book, Kevin. And Kevin, what's been really exciting for me as a friend of yours and somebody who worked with you, all those many years ago, it's just exciting to see something like this come to fruition and, make it to the big time, man. It's great.
Well, thanks a million, Geoff. I really appreciate everything that you're saying there. And it really is great to have it out there. It's great to have it finished. These things take a really long time. Mm-hmm. But I keep looking at my kids and saying, listen, if there's one lesson to be learned It's stay in it for the long haul, and don't be distracted. You and I keep talking about, like, I haven't even been paying attention lately because I'm doing the work, and it's like, do the work.
Yeah, do the work.
If you're in a position, comics gives you the chance to do the work.
Yeah.
That medium, that's the best thing about it. Do the work.
And on that note, I think we can wind it up. I think that's a good place to call it an interview. And so thanks again for being on the show. Wow, that was a very interesting discussion. I hope you enjoyed it, and as much as I did. It was great to touch base with Kevin. I wish him all the success in the world with The Rough Pearl. I hope it burns up the graphic novel charts and somebody picks up the movie rights and make it a wild movie. It's a great book, and it is a wild book, and I think, boy, it would, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody out there in Filmland picks up the rights to it, because I think it's going to make a really great film. So, that's not to say that all comics have to be turned into film, but that's another subject. They don't. Comics are great in their own right. And actually, I'm not a big fan of... now I'm getting off on a tangent. Comics don't have to be... Superheroes don't... when I was a kid, I wanted to see, those kinds of movie realizations of my heroes, Superman and whatnot. We all wanted to believe a man could fly, but it's kind of, for me, it's kind of grown thin. I like the comics. It is always a thrill. It's always a thrill to see a Marvel movie or one of your favorite superheroes up on the screen. But I even prefer the comics to the animated versions. I mean, I love the Fleischer versions of Superman, and they're great in their own right. But it's a different thing, and the experience of comics, reading comics, and all it offers, I'll take the comics. The comics have Jack Kirby, so that's enough, right? Enough said. And that said, okay, so I hope you thought through that idea, that issue about cartoony approaches to heavy-duty subject matter, and certainly Jack Kirby's one of those guys who does that. And of course, Robert Crumb does that, and Seth does that, and the Hernandez brothers do that, and on and on and on. And there's so many. Walt Kelly and Jules Pfeiffer, and so. I think we can win this argument with Kevin. Kevin, if you're listening, I don't know. I think I got you on the ropes there, man. So, and I'm sure that everybody's come up with a bunch. You were probably shouting them at me while you were listening to the podcast, and so I'm glad, in defense of the cartoony, because that's what I like. I like realism too. I like it all. It's a what is a cornucopia of great stuff. That's what comics is. Potpourri, a melange. It's a fun word to say, a melange. So yes, the other thing that I was thinking about, and of course it's interesting to me, but it's probably not interesting to anybody else, because I'm an old guy and I ruminate on this stuff, is the distinction between digital reading and reading. I know. It's belaboring a point that's over and done with, and it really is over and done with. I don't know why. I guess because I'm from that old generation that it's still an issue. But the distinction, I think, and I'm going to talk about it anyway, the distinction is that when you're reading a book or a newspaper, right, in the hard copy, in the paper version of a paperback or a newspaper, it's a personal experience. It's separate. It's isolated. It's alone. You are an individual connecting to this material, and the experience is a private one. The experience when you're reading digitally is not. You're always connected one way or another. Even if you're not, your browser's not open, you're still connected. The filials are still out there. The tendrils are still out there into the internet, the roots of a moss, underground, through or the roots of mushrooms, right? Isn't that what they say? They just, this big fungus reaches out and its tendrils reach everywhere. Well, that's like the internet is a big fungus. So, but when you're reading a book, you're alone. It's a private experience, and there's something that is very important about those private experiences. And I was just talking to my wife about it. My version of Dune is different from her version of Dune, and there are no comments. When I'm reading that book, it's on in paperback or whatever on my own, and I think that's important, and that's something I still enjoy when I'm reading a book. But it's harder and harder to disconnect from the internet, from Instagram, from everything else. And but we got to make time to do it. I got to make time to do it. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do that right now. So I'm going to hang up. I'm going to say, oh, I almost forgot. Self-promotion bit. Check me out on Instagram, okay, at Grogan Geoff, GROGANGEOFF. You can follow me there, keep up with whatever I'm doing. You can also check in with me on Patreon, patreon.com/Geoff Grogan, GEOFFGROGAN. And if you are of the means and the mind, any support you send my way shall be appreciated. Okay. Self-promotion done. Thank you for listening. I'm going to say be well, be healthy, be safe, and I hope your loved ones are all safe and healthy and happy, and just take care of yourself, okay? These are tough times, and we'll get through them. We'll get through them together, and I will see you next time. Next time up, we got the great Brian Walker. Whoa! Brian Walker of Beetle Bailey, son of Mort Walker, great comics historian, great comics writer. Can't wait to have that conversation. So that's up next time, so be looking forward to that, okay? Brian Walker next time around. And again, in the meantime, thanks for listening.